Oh, good morning. I am so excited to be here. The Uber driver this morning was apologizing for the weather. I said, do you know the wind chill is 17 in Chicago? I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to try this with mics. I teach in an auditorium, and I don't use mics. I yell, and so I'm going to try not to revert to yelling, because I'm used to doing that with these mics on. So if it's too loud, somebody just let me know, okay? And I'll bring it down a notch. So let's see. All right, one caveat before I start. So people often ask me to talk about what causes violence. And that usually means what's the one thing that causes violence, right? We like simple solutions, simple answers. And so I need to say that there is no one thing. A colleague of mine, Rebecca White at Arizona State University, said that challenges to society are not disciplinary, and that the solutions to these challenges will not be responsive to discipline-centric approaches. And community violence is no different. I am a clinical psychologist by training, and so my research comes from a psychological perspective. And I view my work as one small piece of a very large and complicated puzzle. Okay. Over the past 10 years or so, over 500 youth under the age of 18 have been killed in Chicago. We see the names of these youth on social media, on t-shirts, sometimes in the news. And these young people who have lost their lives are survived by other young people who often remain nameless. Their friends, their classmates, their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, their neighbors. Young people who must continue on with their lives, carrying the loss and trauma of these incidents and so many others. Our many discussions with young people have led to an interest in how young people manage their exposure to community violence. I did not set out to be a violence researcher. I was a coping researcher. And I studied how African-American youth cope with stressors in multiple domains of their life. And I mean, I measured stressors in all domains: peer relationships, school, family, community, racial discrimination, violence. I was adamant that I wasn't going to hone in on one particular stressor, because how could I decide what stressor might be most important? But over the years, so many conversations with young people and their families have helped us understand that violence exposure, at least in Chicago, is a salient stressor for young people. And they're asking for help in how to deal with their reactions to violence exposure. And so I reluctantly, in the very beginning, began focusing on community violence, I guess probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by exposure to community violence. These are deliberate acts that are intended to cause harm against a person or persons in the community. So this is a violence that's of an interpersonal nature. It's usually committed in public areas, usually by individuals who are not intimately related to the quote-unquote victim. So this is separate from family violence. It's even separate from school-based bullying. Right? It's things that happen in larger public spaces. It may include assault, burglary, the use of weapons. Some measures also assess whether or not kids have heard gunshots or whether or not they've seen drug sales in their community. So we're talking about things that are happening in public spaces. People that study community violence often think about it in two different ways. One is direct victimization. And so this is when a person is the object of the intentional acts that are intended to cause harm. The other is indirect witnessing. And this is when someone sees or hears about violence happening to someone else. My work focuses on kids that are like 6th to 8th grade. And some of the key features of violence exposure around this time, one is that it's uncontrollable. Now, we're talking about community violence. So if you talk to young people, they will tell you that they don't feel like they can control the violence that's happening in their community. So it's uncontrollable. For many young people, it's repetitive and chronic. So they're exposed to trauma multiple times throughout adolescence, or exposed to violence multiple times throughout adolescence. Those of you who study stress or know about stress know that chronic uncontrollable stress is probably the worst type of stress for kids to be exposed to. Okay? The second issue is timing. So it's happening during developmentally vulnerable periods, particularly adolescence. We see an increase in violence exposure, community violence exposure, during adolescence. What's happening during adolescence? It's not a rhetorical question.
Less supervision.
Less supervision. What else are young people dealing with? Puberty. I have a 12-year-old now. Yay, me. Boy, right? Puberty. What else is happening?
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. So we have less supervision, puberty, peer pressure. What else? Dating. Do what? Sex, drugs. I heard something over here. Yeah. So peers are becoming much more important. They're being granted a little bit more autonomy. School's getting a little bit more challenging. So you have all these normative stressors that young people are experiencing, right? And then you pile on something traumatic like violence exposure. Now, I just used the word traumatic. That's another feature of community violence. I'm not going to go into that right now. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Social stratification mechanisms like racism, segregation, oppression marginalize African American youth by situating their development in high-risk contexts. And so we see structural and institutional racism, which leads to concentrated poverty in segregated communities, which leads to elevated levels of violence crime, which for African American youth leads to disproportionate levels of violence exposure. And I'm talking about African American youth in more urban, under-resourced communities. These are some of the outcomes of violence exposure. Now, it's important to note that youth will respond in different ways, but these are some of the most common outcomes. Of these outcomes, which do you think is most strongly and consistently associated with violence exposure? Academic, I've heard academic. What else? Aggression, PTSD, anxiety, all of them. See, that's what my students would say, you're trying to trick us. It's actually delinquency and aggression, so whoever over here, you win the prize. Delinquency, aggression are strongly associated with community violence exposure. Consistently across studies, we see this robust association between violence exposure and engagement in delinquent behavior and aggression. Interestingly, some of the early work on community violence found unexpected associations between violence exposure and depression. They either found that there was no association between the two, or the association was much weaker than expected, or in some cases in an unexpected direction. Now, this led some people to begin to talk about whether or not kids were becoming desensitized to community violence. Okay? Now, what do we mean by desensitization? Well, desensitization is when young people adapt to community violence with blunted emotional distress, and I'm putting adapt in quotes here. Right? This term has its roots in something called habituation. So if any of you are familiar with basic learning models, you're familiar with the term habituation, where an organism is exposed to a stimulus, and then if you keep exposing them to that stimulus, over time they habituate to it. You may see an initial response, and then that response levels off and even starts to decrease. So why is it important that we understand this concept of desensitization? Well, desensitization is directly related to the economic and social burden of community violence. Right? Elevated levels of violent behavior, incarceration, homicide deaths. It also impacts our perception of the functioning of young people who are exposed to violence. So I have heard folks say, well, these kids are desensitized to this. That impacts how we then offer services to them, how we think about intervening for them, if we believe that they've become desensitized. Now, in terms of research, what are some frameworks for desensitization? Well, when I started this work, there was only one, and it was called the Pathologic Adaptation model. So according to this model, there's a linear effect between violence exposure and aggression or delinquent behavior. At the same time, there's a curvilinear effect between violence exposure and what they were calling emotional distress at that time, right? So kids are exposed to violence, right? They start to show slight increases in depressive symptoms. If that violence exposure continues to increase, eventually the depression or the emotional distress would begin to decline. Now, why was this model called adaptive, pathologic adaptation? It was believed that emotional numbing may be adaptive, at least in the short term. It may protect youth from the negative emotional effects of violence exposure. At the same time, they also used this term pathologic. And it was believed that because of the emotional numbing and desensitization, and also the cognitions that normalize violence, that desensitization may reduce inhibitions against the kid then behaving aggressively themselves. Right? So, hence the name pathologic adaptation. Is there any empirical support for desensitization? There's not a lot of research. There's been more in the past 5 or 6 years. But early on, when I started in this area, there were only a handful of studies that had directly examined desensitization to community violence. The problem with these studies is that they were cross-sectional. So everything was assessed at the same time. If we're thinking about desensitization, we're thinking about something that occurs over time. It's repeated exposure. So if you're measuring everything at the same time, you may see this curvilinear effect, but it's harder to think about a causal relationship, right? So I conducted a study, received a little funding to conduct a study that was a longitudinal investigation of this model. And so, hold on, I have a message about an email. We're going to ignore that pop-up. Okay. What we predicted is that there would be a linear association between community violence and violent behavior. So the community violence was being assessed in early adolescence, right? And the outcomes were being assessed in late adolescence. So we were predicting that community violence exposure that was occurring during early to early mid-adolescence was going to predict more violent behavior in late adolescence. But at the same time, we predicted that there would be a curvilinear association between community violence exposure in early adolescence and depressive symptoms in late adolescence. We also said that this would be specific to the affective symptoms of depression. So we know depression has affective symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and somatic symptoms. So we thought that this might be specific to affective symptoms because those may be the ones that kids are suppressing or numbing. The participants in this study were almost 300 boys. They were part of the Chicago Youth Development Study, and I can talk more about that study if anybody has questions about it at the end. African American and Latinx, all from neighborhoods with high levels of crime in Chicago. And this was all collected via self-report over several waves. What did we find? Well, luckily, we found what we predicted, right? That there was a linear association between community violence and violent behavior in late adolescence, but there was a curvilinear association for depressive symptoms. And this was specific to cognitive affective symptoms of depression. We did not see this for somatic symptoms. A follow-up study was actually examined. This is what I call a true test of the pathologic adaptation model, because what this model says is, okay, there's a desensitization effect that occurs, but this actual desensitization effect, this emotional numbing, is what's responsible for the increase in violent behavior. And so we wanted to test that. Same sample, but we wanted to know if depressive symptoms, if ECV would lead to this emotional numbing and depressive symptoms, which would then lead to violent behavior. And that's what we found. But not exactly what we expected. We believed that kids who were coming into adolescence with high levels of violence exposure already, who would then show some increase, would be the ones to show high levels of violent behavior in late adolescence through this emotional numbing, this desensitization. But if you notice, the kids who are coming in at high levels of violence actually show decreases in violent behavior through that desensitization effect, through that emotional numbing. Okay? The kids who came in with low levels of violence exposure in early adolescence, those were the ones that, through the desensitization effect, ended up showing more violent behavior at the end. Right? So, do young people become desensitized to violence? Maybe. Overall, the findings do provide empirical support for desensitization, but we have to consider other explanations. Young people may be intentionally suppressing and underreporting depressive symptoms, particularly affective symptoms. Right? Reporting affective symptoms like crying, right, feeling sad, might increase their likelihood of being a victim. And so they may be less likely to admit those symptoms. It may be easier to admit the somatic symptoms. Right? Having headaches, you don't feel well, not sleeping well. Right? So young people might be underreporting these symptoms. The other issue is that PTSD might be muting depressive symptoms. We know one of the symptoms of PTSD is emotional numbing. And so what we might be seeing is just an impact of violence exposure on PTSD symptoms. What about these kids who came in with high violence exposure that we thought were going to be the ones that would show more violent behavior at the end? Well, it could be that desensitization is actually protective. It's possible. So it's somehow protecting them from the negative emotional experiences that might lead to more violent behavior. It's hard for me to fully accept that as the explanation because there's such a strong link between violence exposure and violent behavior, aggressive behavior. So perhaps there are other pathways for kids who are coming in with high levels of violence exposure that I just didn't assess in this study. Now, what about the ones that are coming in with low levels? Because we focus our attention a lot, especially in our intervention work, on kids who are coming in highly exposed. But what we're seeing is the problem in this sample were the kids who were coming in with low levels of exposure. And when they saw the increase, they were the ones who were showing the aggressive and violent behavior at the end. It could be that because they're coming in with low levels, that the increase in violence exposure is a novel experience for them. They haven't had time to develop the emotion regulation skills that they may be able to use to minimize the negative emotional impact on them. Right? It may also be a trauma reaction. I keep saying trauma. I promise we're going to come back to that. It could be a trauma reaction for them. So we were able to demonstrate the desensitization effect over time, but I was not convinced that I had the full story. And so I want to go back for a minute, if I can do that. Two things happened early in my career that later influenced my thoughts about desensitization. So very early in my career, again, I was studying coping. And I was in the process of developing a culturally relevant coping measure for African American youth. What are strategies that African American youth use to cope that are not on existing mainstream coping measures? And so to do this, we were doing focus groups with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in Chicago. And we did 25 focus groups across the city with students. And there was one particular school. All of these schools were in neighborhoods with high levels of crime, high levels of poverty. But there was one school where the behavior was so different than the other schools. There was a lot of fighting in this school, great deal of fighting. At any moment, a fight could break out, right? The kids seemed to be on edge all the time in the groups, right? Couldn't be still, seemed very nervous, anxious. And several of the groups in that school, when I met with them, in general, I would ask all the groups, what are problems your kids your age face? Right? Most kids, the first thing they talk about is peer relationships, right? I saw my boyfriend walking in the hall with somebody else. Somebody started a rumor about me. I don't like my mom's boyfriend, right? But this one school, several kids talked about, I'm trying to get home without getting shot. Now, I'm not a violence researcher at this point, and hearing that was jarring to me. But a couple of weeks before I had gone into the school, the kids would leave the school and they'd have to walk across the field. This area is all gentrified. It's in the past 18 years, but they'd have to walk across a field to get to, at that time there was a high-rise project building there, and they would have to walk across the field, and someone opened fire as they were walking home. And they were running, ducking for cover, and all they could talk about was that the ice cream man got shot. There was a man outside with an ice cream cart who was outside every day after school, and he got shot. He survived, but for them, they couldn't shake that, right? And when I think about those kids, when I would think about them from time to time, like they didn't seem desensitized to me. Another thing that happened is I was, at the time, working on understanding links between stress and coping and internalizing symptoms. I was doing a lot of work on anxiety and depression. And I was doing a study where I was trying to understand the common and unique stressors and coping strategies that were associated with depression and anxiety in African American youth. I had a sample of almost 300 African American. These were 6th through 8th graders. Now, I'm not going to go through all these findings, but what I want to show you something in particular. I told you I measured stress in every single domain. If you notice violence victimization right here, it's associated with the unique feature of anxiety called physiological hyperarousal, but it's not associated with depression, right? Now, again, this was years before I started doing work on desensitization, when I had the idea for this project. But when I started wondering, when I did start working on desensitization, could there be something different for depression and anxiety? And could it be that what I was seeing in those kids might be reflective of what is happening here? So in my very first study of, my very first study of desensitization, I decided to do something that was a little bit different than what had been done in the previous literature. People who had studied desensitization had separated, they had a emotional distress factor that they were measuring, which would lump together depression and anxiety symptoms. So I decided to separate them. And what I thought is that we would see this curvilinear association to depression, but not for anxiety. Because people up to this point had just been saying, well, the desensitization effect is for internalizing disorders. These were our 6th through 8th graders. And that's exactly what we found. There was a curvilinear association for depression as predicted, but a linear association for anxiety. Okay. So as violence increases, depression increases to a point, and it starts to decline. But anxiety continues to increase. This is just another study that examines it a different way, putting people in groups based on their violence exposure. We ended up with 3 groups, one that had high levels of exposure, one that had lower levels, and one that had high levels of victimization. But what we saw is that the high exposure group had the lowest levels of depressive symptoms, consistent with the desensitization effect. There was no difference for anxiety between those groups. So one of the focus groups that I did was in a school with K through 8th grade. And I was supposed to meet with a group of 8th grade boys one morning. And I went to the school and gave the principal the list of kids who needed to be called out for the group. And she went through the list, and Kevin is not his real name, and she saw Kevin's name, and she said, oh, Kevin can't participate. And I said, well, Kevin brought back a consent form that was signed by his parents. So I would really appreciate it if Kevin would participate. And she said, well, he doesn't deserve to be in this group. And I said, well, it's not a group that's based on rewards. And she's like, well, he's a troublemaker. And I said, I want all the kids I can get in this group. And Kevin's parents signed a consent form. I'd like for him to be called down. She said, okay. So I go to meet up with the young man. Teacher is bringing them down. She's walking with me. She's like, you're going to go in there with them by yourself? I'm like, this is like the 5th time I've been in the school. But yes, I am. And she's like, you going to be okay? Yes, I am, yeah. So I go in the room, I'm sure I'm fine, go in the room, sit down with these young men, had a wonderful meeting with them. I didn't have any trouble out of these boys. And that was because there was one person who kept them all in line. And who was that? Kevin. Kevin said, you all are going to respect this woman? I was like, Kevin is good with me, right? But I didn't have any issues with them because Kevin kept them, if anybody got out of line, Kevin said, hey, But what I want to say about Kevin is 14 years old, was 14 years old. But he looked much older than his stated age. And we already know the research showing that African-American boys are perceived to be older than they actually are by authority figures, right? And then you have this young man who does look older. And he talked about having to walk to school when I asked him about the kinds of problems they deal with, having to walk to school and being harassed by the police, being harassed by older men in the community, and how stressful that was for him. And so when I asked the question in the group, how do you know that you're stressed out? Kevin the whole time was leaning forward, just taking all of this in, right? And I said, how do you know that you're stressed out? And he said, look at my nails. Look at my nails. I bite my nails when I get nervous. And they were down to the quick. This was a nervous young man. And again, that's that anxiety, right, coming up, that hyperarousal. So I'm thinking about all of these prior experiences, right, these anecdotes, these stories, and trying to make them fit with the research, and they're not fitting. And I don't know what to do. So we had a grad student in our department at that time. She was in the developmental psych program, and she was studying desensitization of media violence, violent video games. Right? And they would bring students in, they called them gamers, who played video games for 40 plus hours a week. I don't know how they did their study, I don't know what they did, but somehow they found time to play video games for 40 hours a week. And they'd bring them in, take them down to the basement in our building, they'd hook them up to an EEG and let them play violent video games and track their brain activity. So I brought her into our lab meeting one week to just give a talk about her work, and tell us what she does. Right? And I told her where we were stuck around this issue, that I'm seeing kids who don't seem to be desensitized, but we're finding this desensitization effect. There's something going on between depression and anxiety. I can't make sense of it. And she said one question to me that completely changed my life, my research life, not my real life. And she said, you all don't have different types of desensitization in the community violence literature? And I said, no, you just say desensitization. She said, oh, in media violence, there are different types of desensitization. So she said we have emotional desensitization, where there's the blunted emotions. Right? We have a cognitive desensitization where you begin to normalize violence. And we have a physiological desensitization, where you stop having that physical reaction to violence over time. I call it the Kill Bill effect. Has anybody seen Kill Bill? There's a lot of violence in that movie, right? First 5 minutes, I'm just a startle response, right? By the end, chopping off heads and stuff, and I'm just sitting there, right? You can get desensitized. So, and the research on media violence has shown that people can get desensitized in these 3 ways to media violence. Now, what we were seeing was emotional desensitization. So all these years that community violence was studying desensitization, what we were studying was emotional desensitization. We hadn't really, now there's some work on cognitive desensitization, it's called something else, but in relation to like bullying and peer violence. We weren't really doing much with these, but we were calling everything desensitization. Right? This physiological hypersensitization or desensitization, really falls under hyperarousal symptoms from PTSD. So in those kids that I was meeting with in that school, with Kevin, these are the types of symptoms they were experiencing, right? Which is why I wasn't seeing what I thought was desensitization, because in some ways they're not desensitized to violence. So even though the media violence literature shows that people can be desensitized in 3 different ways, I wasn't convinced that that was what was happening with community violence. Community violence is a traumatic stressor. There's a threat of loss of your own life, loss of someone else's life, serious harm. And unlike media violence, you can't shut it off when you get tired of it. Okay? It's a traumatic stressor. We know that repeated exposure over time leads to what Bruce Perry calls as threat sensitization in the brain, right? It affects the stress response system in our brain, and we become threat sensitized. So those young people who were on edge, who couldn't be still, were threat sensitized. Right? So what happens is when you have this threat sensitization, you're walking down the hallway at school and somebody bumps into you, right? Rather than just saying, oh, excuse me, sorry, it's okay, man, we're good, right? What happens? You turn and punch. Or you turn and say something because you're threat sensitized. Right? And so what I believed is that community violence may produce an emotional desensitization and probably a cognitive desensitization, but it was producing a physiological hypersensitization. Now, can all this happen at the same time? That was my next question. I actually found out that it might be possible. So there is a model of learning called the dual process model. Goes back way back to the 50s. Right? We did a lot of work on sea slugs around this. And what they found is that the same stimulus can produce both a desensitization effect of one outcome and a hypersensitization effect of a different outcome in the same organism. Now, what causes the desensitization, or what they were calling habituation, was repeated exposure. So being exposed repeatedly could produce a desensitization of one type of effect or outcome. But the strength or the harmfulness of the stimulus could also sensitize them in other outcomes at the same time. These are independent processes, but they combine to form an overall behavioral response. And so what I believe is that you have this repeated violence exposure, you have cognitive emotional desensitization occurring, emotional numbing, normalizing violence. At the same time, you become threat sensitized, on edge. The combination of those leads to more aggression and violence perpetration. Now, I wanted to test this out. How are we doing? I'm doing okay. So I tried to test this model with 9th to 12th grade boys. This was a study we were doing with a school on risk and protective factors for African American boys. And so we pulled some data out of that to test this model. So what these three lines mean is that this was all linear. So this is my little curvilinear term down here, which did nothing. So as expected, we saw more aggression over time. We saw more hyperarousal, or physiological hyperarousal over time, but we didn't see our curvilinear association for depression in this sample. This was a linear effect for these boys, right? There was nothing for cognitive. And I can talk more about that if anybody has questions about it later. I also wanted to see if any of these three things would mediate, if violence would lead to any of these, and which would then lead to aggressive behavior. Of course, the only thing we found was for the physiological hyperarousal. So violence exposure led to more physiological hyperarousal, which then led to more aggressive behavior. We didn't see any mediation effects for depression like we saw in the previous study. All right, so first, no emotional desensitization. So I have found this effect in tons of samples, right? Not tons, but most of my work has found this curvilinear effect. Other people have found it. I do this study, I don't find it. What in the world is happening, right? These boys, the more violence they experience, the more depression they experience. I talked to a few people who study desensitization and community violence, and they all said the same thing to me. Your sample is older than all these other samples. Everything you've ever done work with has been middle school kids. These are high school kids. Everything we've ever done work on has been middle school kids. We've measured the violence exposure in middle school. You've measured it in high school in these boys. What we know about community violence is that the older that kids get, the more severe forms of violence that they experience, the more likely they are to be victimized, which may lead to more depression. So they're experiencing more severe stressors, severe violence exposure. They're more likely to be victims when they're older than when they're younger adolescents. Grief and loss, we may be tapping into. Community violence takes the lives of young people's loved ones. And homicide deaths of loved ones peaks at ages 15 to 17 for African American boys. And that was the age of my sample. So what we might be capturing is, through the depressive symptoms, is grief and loss. This was also a unique sample. It was a charter school, all-male charter school in Chicago. And another researcher who's done some work with this school, did an ethnographic study with this school, found that some of the boys in the school were struggling with identity. The identity in the school and then the identity in the community, and that they were reporting some symptoms of depression. So it may be the uniqueness of this sample too. But whatever the case, we did not find the emotional desensitization in this sample. We did find the physiological hypersensitization. So unlike media violence, we didn't see the decrease in physiological hyperarousal. It was actually an increase, consistent with what we know about violence exposure, community violence exposure as a traumatic stressor. We also saw that there were mediation effects for physiological hyperarousal. So violence exposure led to more physiological hyperarousal, which led to more violence or violent behavior, aggressive behavior later on. Something called hyperarousal-induced aggression. I just gave you the example of walking down the hall. Right? You're on edge, and so it's a reactive form of aggression. Unlike hypo-arousal-induced aggression, where people have low levels, baseline levels of arousal, so they engage in the behaviors to increase those levels, right? We're talking about kids who are elevated levels of arousal, and then they react. Right? So I'm not going to go into great detail about this, as I'll talk about intervention more in the workshop later on, but I really want to say this is a public health issue. It's not a criminal justice issue. We have to stop punishing kids for how they behave in response to what they've experienced and start helping them deal with what they're experiencing. And so until we start viewing this as a public health issue and seeing this as an issue of trauma, I have concerns about how long it's going to continue. I also want to say that this model I'm talking about, I don't think is a universal model, right? This dual process model that I've been proposing. It's not going to fit for every kid, but I've seen a lot of kids that I think it fits their experience. We have a lot of violence prevention programs out there. What I've learned from implementing some of those interventions is they're focused on skills. Right? We're trying to help kids develop the skills to interact appropriately in these interpersonal situations. Right? How many of y'all have used these before? Right? Helping kids to stop and think about. Yes, conflict resolution. Stop and think before you react, right? Which I think is funny because how many of us do that? Some of y'all yelled at somebody on the way of driving over here, didn't you? Right? We don't always stop and think, and our levels of trauma exposure are low, right? But the problem I have with some of these interventions, not that they're not worthwhile, but the framework from which they come. They're coming out of a skills deficit framework, that kids don't have the skills to do this and we need to teach them. And I wonder why we're not considering hostile attributions and aggressive cognitions as reactions to trauma and not just skills that kids didn't learn at some point in their lives. Right? And so I think that our interventions not only need to address skills, but they need to address symptoms first. Right? Then we can get to the skills. Now, the other issue is, are we disabling survival strategies through our interventions? This is a new question that we're grappling with. So some colleagues of mine in Baltimore have studied PTSD in African American men, like 18 to 25. And they did a qualitative study where they talked to men about PTSD symptoms to get their thoughts on them. Now what they found is that almost everybody in their sample met the criteria for PTSD. Right? But the symptom they endorsed with the highest frequency was hyperarousal and hypervigilance. When they asked them about this, the young men said, oh yeah, we know that fits us, but we need to do that. We have to be on point. So they labeled something we call a symptom as a coping strategy. I'm gonna say that again. They labeled something we call a symptom as a coping strategy. So they feel like they need to stay hypervigilant, aware of their surroundings. Even though it looks to us like they're highly anxious, they need to do that to stay safe. This is what they're reporting. So if we're coming in with an intervention to reduce symptoms, it's counter to what they believe they need to survive in the community. Now again, this qualitative study was with older emerging adults. So we wanted to see if this was actually the case in an adolescent sample. So this is a lot of stuff on this slide. But let me just say this. We really wanted to, you can actually focus on this side. We wanted to know if symptoms of hyperarousal, including hypervigilance, would actually be adaptive and predict less violence exposure a year later, which would be consistent with what the African American men were reporting, that they think was happening for them. Right? So these are high school boys. They completed a PTSD symptom scale as part of this study. There's a hyperarousal subscale, so we use this score. There are 5 items on here. These are some of the items. But then we pulled out the hypervigilance item to examine it alone. So we did both of these, right? 2 time points, 1 year apart. We found that hypervigilance at time 1 predicted less witnessing at time 2. There's less exposure to community violence, and that's controlling for prior levels of witnessing. We found that the global construct of hyperarousal predicted less victimization at time 2, but only when physical aggression was high. So there was an interaction between these two. So when kids showed high levels of hyperarousal and high levels of physical aggression, they were less likely to be victimized later on. So, what does this say? If we're coming in to reduce these symptoms, but it's actually protecting them. Don't wait for me to answer that question because I don't have an answer for it. Some of y'all are looking at me like, okay, I don't have an answer yet. We will talk about that this afternoon. I don't know. This is the interaction effect, if you guys see. This is high levels of physical. Do you see how this decreases? That's high levels of physical aggression. That's the decrease in victimization. Sharp. You see the other 2 levels of physical aggression. I won't talk about that. So the hypervigilance predicted less witnessing. I think it's because the community violence can lead, if you witness other people being exposed to violence, it can lead to these diffuse feelings of vulnerability. It can happen to anybody, right? And so you need to be on alert because it could happen to anybody, anytime. Right? Hyperarousal and aggression interacting to predict less victimization. We don't really know. I mean, this study is under review right now. The paper is under review. We tried to frame it related to hyperarousal-induced aggression. I'm happy to hear any thoughts that people may have about this. Why we're seeing less victimization for kids who are showing high levels of arousal and high levels of aggression. That was a protective model, which is a different way to ask the question, and we didn't find anything for that. So I want to say this. I have had a hard time with this concept of pathologic adaptation because of the term pathologic. And I recently did some work. I have another line of research. It's more theoretical, conceptual, on positive youth development in boys of color. And we have applied a conditional adaptation model to that work, that young people living in high stress contexts may become more stress adapted. And there's a concept known as adaptive calibration or conditional adaptation. And what this says is that in contexts of high levels of stress or adversity, young people may show behaviors that maximize their ability to survive, to adapt in that setting. Let's just say adapt, to adapt to that setting. Those behaviors may not translate outside of that setting, right? They may work well in that setting, but not outside of it. And this is conditional adaptation. So rather than viewing these behaviors and these symptoms as pathologic, I think it's better to think about them as conditional. Right? They work in one setting. Now, the question, of course, is, do they work in other contexts? What this model says is that in dangerous, unpredictable environments, the stress will shape our stress response system towards different patterns, and two patterns pop up for dangerous and unpredictable environments. One is a vigilant pattern. So you show vigilance to maintain safety, and the other is an unemotional pattern. You show unemotional responding. Right? These are to maximize the ability to adapt in dangerous, unpredictable contexts, and that's what we've seen in this work. And I think it's better to think about this as they themselves describe it, as a way to cope, right? Rather than pathologizing it. Now, we do have to ask the question about what about other contexts? So if hyperarousal and aggression are great for minimizing violence in the community, but then you go to school, yeah, you heard me, right? You go to school, zero tolerance policies, right? Criminal justice system, juvenile justice system, not responsive to these behaviors, right? They don't see them as conditional adaptation, they see them as pathologic adaptation. Or pathologic, they don't even have the adaptation part on there, just pathologic. Right? Some next steps. So just in terms of the work, I got to figure out what's going on with age. Okay, wait, let me say this first. Somebody out there is sitting there like, why is she only talking about boys? Does she know girls have violence exposure too? Yes, I know. It's not that I was only interested in boys, it's just that that access to that data kind of fell in my lap, and so we started there. We are moving into doing this work with girls now, and trying to understand if we see the same effects. Some of that very early work I presented had both boys and girls in the sample, but we really want to tease these effects apart to understand the role of gender and gender identity, and also age. Right? Why do we see older boys showing this linear effect? We have some cross-sectional data where I have a sample of, these are two data sets I haven't presented yet here. One is with middle school kids, one is with high school kids. We see a curvilinear effect between violence exposure and depression for boys in early adolescence and for girls in early adolescence. Then we have another data set with high school kids. And we see a curvilinear effect for girls in late adolescence, but we have a linear effect again for boys in that. So something different is happening for older boys. And we really want to try to tease that apart. So we're moving in that direction with the work. So you have young men saying that hyperarousal is something that helps them. Our work has shown with adolescents that it actually can help them. But what are the long-term effects of hyperarousal? Of constantly being on alert, with your stress system constantly being active. What does that do to your body? Right? And that's something we're trying to explore as well. What are the long-term, especially physical effects of this hyperarousal and hyper? We're going to talk about this later on in the workshop. So I do want to note this, though. My colleagues I mentioned who did the study in Baltimore, they have a beautiful phrase in their study. It was like, what post? Post-traumatic stress disorder means after the stressor. But what about folks who are continuously exposed to stress? There is no post. Grief and loss interventions, this is wide open. There are a couple of people now. When I first started doing this research, there was really nobody, one person I knew, who was doing work on grief and loss in young people. Particularly young people of color. You think about if anybody's experienced a loss, how traumatic that is. Can you imagine by the age of 17 having lost 4 people? I know kids who've had, some of you know kids, and we don't have anything in place. We don't even know that much about how young people grieve. Disruptive behavior disorders, ADHD, we'll talk a little bit about this. Some of these behaviors, some of you already know this. Some kids get diagnosed with ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders when it's really a trauma reaction, yes. Right? Yes. Okay? Substance use. This is another area that's wide open for work. Young people are self-medicating to deal with these symptoms. And what I found out recently is scaring. It's scary that I was giving a talk somewhere and someone who was working around substance use with young people said, you know, the problem now is they'll use anything. They don't even know what it is. Just to figure out how to feel better, right? How to deal with the emotional response to this. Going back to Kevin. So one of the questions I asked towards the end of the groups, when I did the focus groups, was once we identified all the problems that they have to do, well, what do you do to deal with your problems? Remember, I was trying to pull out coping strategies that might be culturally relevant. And Kevin said, I'll be honest, he said, I smoke. And he said, it helps me settle down. I have to settle down. A few weeks later, I was in the school, and the principal told me that Kevin had been expelled because he kept coming to school high. Yeah. So we got to do better with our young people. So Acknowledgments, my wonderful lab has supported the Chicago Public Schools. A couple of my mentors who've helped shape this work. Laura Stockdale is the media violence researcher who changed our lives. Division 53, these are some of the funders who funded some of this work. Thank you, and questions. Okay, I'm deferring to her. Okay, because everybody's looking at me like my hand is up. Do you see me? I saw her coming with the mic.
So I'm wondering if you can help me think through this, and I wonder if I'm thinking too simplistically. But you noted that the conditional adaptation may be protective, and that coming in at an individual trauma-focused level to reduce hyperarousal might not be the best strategy. And it almost makes me feel like the really the most logical or only way we should be intervening is to make the environment safer. Is that okay? So it just beckons universal programming at schools and neighborhoods.
It beckons fighting racism and oppression. And
right? Yeah.
We got to go there.
Yeah.
These structural issues.
Yeah.
I try to end all of my papers with this statement. You know, the best way to deal with this is to deal with the structural conditions that create higher levels of violent crime in the first place. Stop closing schools. Stop, underfunding school. I mean, I could go on. I'm not going to get on my soapbox. I could go on. But
I think I'd like your soapbox.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not, she's.
Okay, so I work in a school, and some of the things that you presented I see daily, especially with the high school boys. So I had a student who said what was referred for anger management, and he said, I like being angry. I don't see a problem with it. And I had that exact intervention of, we need to, the skill. But then hearing you say like they can't adapt inside of the school, and you say we need to focus on the not the skill, but
the symptoms.
I guess I don't know where to go from there, because that, to me, that is we need to teach them the skill of adapting in a different environment.
So that's a different skill. You're absolutely right. So the skills I was talking about were the skills and the interventions where they say, oh, the kids are coming in with a deficit. They don't know how to respond in socially appropriate ways. Some of them do. They just don't, because it's not helpful, right?
Right.
And so I really want to do intervention work so bad, but I've been so slow to get there because I'm like, we're not ready yet, right? Because what I think is exactly what you said, that we need to figure out how to teach kids when to use these skills and when not to use them, or where to use them and where not to use them. Right? I remember, again, this is when I first moved to Chicago. I was running an interventionist in the schools for this violence intervention, going in the classroom teaching kids these skills. But there was one teacher in the school, and what she did every morning is she turned off the lights, and she made them sit in silence and breathe for 2 minutes. Right now, a lot of schools, my kids' schools do this. They have the whole video they watch, listen to do it. But this was novel 20 years ago. But that stayed with me because what she was doing was helping them do what nobody helped Kevin do, which is, okay, you're not walking through the neighborhood anymore. Right. You're in school. Let's ground. Let's settle down. Right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
First off, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Secondly, my question is, when you found the mediation between high hypervigilance, but then high aggression, and it led to low long-term violence. In the moment when they were demonstrating high hypervigilance and high aggression, have there been any studies, or what would your hypothesis be on peer relations at that point, if they're showing hypervigilance and high aggression?
So in terms of the acceptability of that behavior by peers or the endorsement of it, I actually about a month ago was reading a little bit about peer endorsement of certain behaviors, right? And that young people are, well, you know what? I take that back. I was working on a section for a policy briefing, and I had to write about adolescence. And so, what I learned is that in adolescence, kids are. This is all from New Brains, imaging studies, are very sensitive to the evaluations of others. We kind of know this anyway, right? But they've shown different parts of the brain that become active, right, in these situations. And so they're very sensitive to what other people think. So if their peers are supporting the behaviors, then it may be more likely that they show the behaviors, right? I'll talk a little bit about this afternoon. There's some work where they actually did a wonderful thing, which is ask kids about interventions before they went in and did them, and these large-scale interventions. And the kids said, well, we don't think this is going to work, or this is not, nobody's going to like us to do, if I do this. Right? And some of it was reducing some of the levels of aggression, and they didn't think it would work, and they didn't think their peers would approve of it.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Listen, these studies deal with kids in environments that they perceive to be high threat environments. Have you done anything in relation to perception of violence or environment? I've got kids in what I would call a mixed environment school that don't live in a background of violence, but they act as if they are, and every moment that they live in is in that world of violence.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
And so you're talking about kids that aren't coming from communities with high levels of violence, but they're still behaving as though they're on edge. And this is not my area of research, but I have a lot of thoughts about social media and what's available to them at their fingertips at any moment. So I think we're seeing kids they can be exposed through media as well. And nobody's really saying that except Desmond Patton. I'll give you that name, Desmond Patton, Patton. He's at Columbia in New York, social work professor, amazing work on something he calls internet banging, right? Which is how violence plays out on the internet, right? And so he's showing that kids can be exposed to violent situations just by interacting with others or following some of these accounts where people are what he calls beefing online, right? But then we're also exposed to, violent media. We're exposed to what's happening in the news every day. So I think kids get it. My work really focuses on what happens in the community, but kids can get it from many different places. And I think that maybe my guess is that you're seeing kids being exposed through other mediums.
And the only thing I can tell their parents is that look at your kid today, and if we don't do something at 17, what are you going to do when he turns 18?
Right.
And he's still living in that mindset.
Right. Got to do something at 7. Right?
We have a question over here.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to refer to your study with the 18 to 25-year-olds.
Okay, that wasn't my study.
Well, that's
okay. Okay.
But the hypersensual?
Hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance. Okay, is there a correlation between the hypervigilance? Hypervigilance of young men who live in what they call pathological adaptation? Mm-hmm. So what's the correlation between young men who live in a community of where they have to really apply that pathological adaptation versus to men who work in the community and actually succumb to the same pathological adaptation?
Okay, so are you talking, when you say work in the community, are you talking about folks who are providing services?
No, I'm talking about simply the shooting of unarmed black men.
Oh, you mean, okay.
And with that same persona.
Yes.
How do we justify both?
So if I understand your question correctly, what about other men in the community, not just those who might be dealing with this community, like the community violence?
I'm talking about the two mentalities.
Oh, the two mentalities.
Right, the justification of the two mentalities. One is seen as a sickness, and the other one is justified as you had to do or protective factor.
Right.
One is a sickness, one is a protective factor. What's the difference?
So these are just two different models. One perceives the behaviors to be problematic. That's the pathologic, right? It doesn't mean that the young men believe that. It's just that's the way researchers have framed it. The young men frame it from a conditional adaptation, which is, this is helping me to survive. So what I've decided is that to talk about how we have to stop saying pathologic adaptation, because that's our framing of it, not their framing of it, right? So we need to think about this as conditional. And so what we're trying, this is helping shift the narrative. So we're trying to shift the narrative on how these young men are perceived. So again, I have another line of work that's more conceptual where we talk about positive youth development in African-American boys. And so we've applied that model, right, in saying, let's stop seeing certain behaviors as being pathologic, as being maladaptive, and start seeing them as ways that young people are dealing with stress, right? And then let's intervene from that point, and not from this point that something is wrong with them. Okay, we got it. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gaylord.